My last name is kind of famous, and for those not familiar with it, it's Butterick. And no matter where I am, there is always this first thing that comes to mind with sewing patterns associated in most people's company. As soon as I spell out the name, the most common response is, "Oh, just like the sewing pattern." Now, I have to say that the sewing pattern market has greatly changed since the days that the Butterick Publishing Company were first established. It's waned a lot when basically fabric became more expensive to make your own clothes than to buy ready-made clothing. But it is true that the Butterick sewing patterns are still available in print long after Ebenezer Butterick, a tailor of men's fashions in Sterling, Massachusetts, noticed that his wife Ellen was struggling to scale down a one-size adult cardboard pattern to fit their infant son into similar clothing in 1863. Now, Ebenezer was acquainted with tailoring, so he knew how to scale clothes to a person for custom work. And instead of using the cardboard, he drew out patterns with tissue paper with different percentages on it. And it wasn't long before the entire Butterick family of Fitchburg, Massachusetts, was mailing out youth-scaled patterns around the country, since up until that time, the only kind of patterns available tended to be men's patterns. And later, the company moved to Manhattan, where a large skyscraper is built on the lower part of Manhattan that is still standing today. Now, locally, I've come across national ads for the Butterick pattern in the Decatur Daily Republican in the 1870s through the 1890s. And Ebenezer made a fortune and established philanthropic causes in Massachusetts, especially his hometown of Fitchburg and in Sterling, and died in Manhattan in 1903. Now, I have to be clear, in spite of my illustrious last name, I received no compensation or royalty checks for the continued usage of my surname for corporate purposes. I am not a direct descendant of Ebenezer or Ellen Butterick, and unless we go back to probably the same village in Lincolnshire, England, where the surname seems to have originated. Butterwick means dairy farmer, and the towns of East and West Butterwick, they're both on either side of the River Trent, still exist and were listed as a village in even the Domesday Book of 1066. And yet, wherever I go, I am accosted or associated and often criticized for having difficult family sewing patterns. I've never used a Butterick sewing pattern, so I don't know how difficult it is to follow one. But several critics proudly claim to me that they use McCall patterns because they're easier. But I hate to bring up the subject that at this point in corporate history, McCall's and Butterick are owned by the same corporate overlords. So you're still supporting Butterick patterns, even when you don't buy them. And then there's the issue with my popular first name, Jason. I suspect if you are a man somewhere between the ages of 38 to 52, you might know a Jason in your class, because it was certainly a very popular name. And whenever someone yells Jason in a crowded space, there's usually a dozen of us that turn our heads looking for who called out our name. We're paunchy and often hair-thinning men. And it was a very popular name from 1970 to 1979, peaking about 1977. There were 4 people named Jason in my class. alone. 3 of them graduated with me. And our name, Jason, is Greek in origin and means healing, healer, and it's probably also familiar to you from the myth of the Golden Fleece and Jason and the Argonauts' pursuit. Jason also appears in Scripture. He appears twice in the New Testament and once in books we don't accept, the kind of books between the Old and the New Testament that are commonly called the Apocrypha. But I suspect that Jason's popularity dropped precipitously with the release of a movie in 1980, the first of the seemingly endless series of Friday the 13th movies that featured the fictional antagonist Jason Voorhees. But whether it's my first name or my surname, I get associated with things I have nothing to do with and things that I am familiar with too. I'm stuck between identities here. It is between fact and fiction, between story and history. And I'm sure that each of us can share a story of how we got our names, that there's probably a family story attached to it, or maybe there's a genealogist, amateur or professional, that has revealed the origins of our surnames. Because whenever we name something, it gets something attached to it, associated with it, whether it's verified or legendary, where we came from, our life experiences shaping and molding us and becoming, in a way, our identity, our name. We will always be associated with the surname of such and such in a place. Over 10 years ago, my childhood home in Beement caught fire and was considered a total loss, so they tore it down and have rebuilt a really nice house on the site. But I imagine that among people that still live in Beement that remember the Buttericks living there for some 30 years, still refer, and probably to the dismay of visitors, give directions based on the old Butterick home that used to stand there as a way to get to the Forest Preserve Park. And I will always be associated with music as the musical son of Richard and Louise Butterick. Now, my mother has a clever name because she goes by her middle. And whenever a telemarketer would call our house when we were kids and ask for Mary Butterick, we knew that there was no one by that name. My mother's Mary Louise. But I'm also associated with the Millikan School of Music graduate who was responsible for the history frames along the second floor of Schilling Hall. In fact, when my family went to visit and see the new Department of Theater and Dance building on campus, we had a retired staff member see us approach the building and say, "The Buttericks are here," and immediately proceeded to introduce us to the new president of Millikan University and revealed that I was someone who could probably answer any question he might have about James Millikan from my research when I was a student in university history, and I was doing great work as the pastor of Prairie Avenue Christian Church. Now, I'll leave it to your judgment whether I'm doing good work as pastor of Prairie Avenue Christian Church, but this is what the person heard in association with my name. That is the reputation I have from that informal source. And it is reputation that's at the heart of our lesson today, revealed in a few pearls of advice for living a good life. Our exploration begins in the book of Proverbs and provides us a concentrated graduate course in the art of good living. It reveals life somehow works. coherently and good and stable and full of wholeness, because God made everyone and everything. There's not a whole lot of thou shalt do's and thou shalt not do's that you'll discover in the book of Proverbs. It's more a case of patterns of life that always seem to work. And the key to a good life is to pattern it after the function and manners and ways that work almost all the time. Advice is only as good as it being applied. And oftentimes we think of Proverbs as, a penny saved, a penny earned, those sort of things. And it seems to be that in Proverbs there's two paths that are always offered. There's the path of the wise and the path of the foolish. And our lesson today is about having a good name that is worth more than anything else we could acquire in life. We have seen this happen again and again in life, that a good name becomes sullied in scandal, so much so that the name is no longer acceptable. Think of the names of Madoff, or certainly in the news this past week, the trial of Elizabeth Holmes, and as a deceptive corporate Silicon Valley darling that fell from grace when the lies about her company could no longer hold back the truth. There are certain names who, no matter what they do, no matter how much they pay, no matter who their publicist is or how much professional marketing management is acclaimed, they can never take away their association with something awful. There is this profound consequence of practical experience. This is more than a name change. True character is revealed in how we treat those who have nothing to offer us. Because we have a tendency as human beings to always treat people better if we have something to gain from them. Whether it's increased power or influence or networking, that sort of thing. God does not make only the rich, we are reminded in our passage today, but God notices also those who exploit their rich positions at the cost of poor people. Both are created by God. God makes a spirited defense and will make that same spirited defense against those who choose to exploit others. We all, in some way, great or small, defend our reputations, but how do you model your reputation, and how do you keep your reputation? When someone hears your name spoken in public, what do you think is the first statement associated with it? What does your life story tell about your values or your priorities? A solid reputation requires a life of thoughtfulness and kindness. It is truly how you spend time and resources that reveal the extent of your wisdom or the depth of your foolishness. Wise people tend to always be humble in their life and living. They choose to associate with a good community. Our text today reminds us that one who is generous is also blessed when they share with the poor, but one who only sows sin, uses bullying or anger to get one's way, will sputter into nothing. How often have bullies been revealed? And how often and how rare do we hear of goodness being expressed by caring for others and sharing with others? When one shares one's life, one is never found wanting. Fill your life not with acquisitions, which frankly are ultimately destined to a discounted and donated estate sale of the future, but with being committed to doing justice, those who are involved in the real matters of life have little time for the frivolities and momentary moments of popular culture. We won't remember too many celebrity actions even a year from now. A life lived in thoughtful consideration of others, kindness that's extended on behalf of others, resources and time spent in seeking justice for those whose value is still being denied or whose humanity is often questioned, requires no assertive claims or bragging rights. As a sage once wrote, one who loves a pure heart and who speaks with grace will have the king for a friend. And as another saying goes, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. A few years back, the magazine Business Insider offered a few suggestions for how one could make such a great first impression. Among the list of suggestions were just these few. Listening 10 times more than you talk. Shifting the spotlight to others. And choosing your words carefully. In a world where often getting your 2 cents into every online argument convinces no one, other than the choir you already know agree with you, and a culture that tries to tell you that what you should value the most and benefits a few even more. Interestingly, they always encourage something that helps their bottom line in the process of making you a popular person. The practical truth is good life is revealed not by opinions and judgment, but by participating in supporting one another, in communities with one another. When you are looking for a fight, it's often because you're not really in one to begin with. And you often take that first shot without thinking of the consequences. Those who are engaged in fights that truly matter often cannot spare a minute's time to talk about it. Imagine a world with less jabber and more listening. Not listening to respond or react with an emoji, but listening to understand, comprehend, figure, and discuss. Those who share the spotlight with others often do not have to look for one when the time might be appropriate. Careful talk is always better than careless reactions. As I say, to myself and to others, Facebook is forever. We seek to live out a piece of the divine life within our own living, our hearts in sync with the very heart of God. Those who know their God will consistently regard all persons more highly than they regard ruthless loyalty to financial advantage and the further aggregation of what is temporal powers here on earth while we still have breath. What you keep in life, you will ultimately lose every time. And what you give will never be lost from you. So what are you keeping that will cost your reputation? And what are you giving that will leave an impression on others? Oh, true, our good name is often inherited. What you do with your inheritance speaks to your character. Does it speak a good word about one who desires to love God and neighbor as self. A truly good life often leaves others speechless. Does yours? Amen.